Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at the second half of chapter 3, which is looking at market failures. So the study guide says you need to know 4 different types: public goods, externalities, asymmetric information, and common access resources. As I said to you, we're going to learn common access resources after the SAC. And you also need to be able to explain how the impact of things like indirect taxation, subsidies, government regulations, and government advertising can be used, how they can be used to try and avoid these types of market failure or rectify these market failures. So first of all, make sure you've got a really clear definition of what market failure is. It's when the unregulated market is unable to allocate resources to maximise the welfare or living standards of society. So when the free market, left to its own devices, which relies on the price system, self-interest and consumer sovereignty, fails to allocate resources in a manner that maximises society's best interest. Often leads to an over-under allocation of some products and an under-allocation of resources to certain areas as well, so that allocative efficiency is not maximised. When markets fail, the government intervenes. So when you're doing questions about market failure, what you're thinking about is, why is this thing a market failure? If the government doesn't do anything, what is the problem with this particular product or good or service? So in terms of market failures, there's essentially 3 we've looked at so far, but splitting positive and negative externalities into 2 different ones. You need to be able to articulate why each of them is an example of a market failure. So we'll go into each in more detail, but just as a quick snapshot, with public goods, the market failure is that they're not allocated in a free market despite possessing benefits for society. Because you can't make a profit out of these products, no self-interested producer will produce them because free riders will choose not to pay, and therefore they're not allocated in a free market. Producers don't produce them despite the fact that they have positive benefits for society. Negative externalities, they're over-allocated in a free market because consumers and producers don't pay the third-party cost. They don't consider them. They don't impact their profits. Therefore, the private benefits often exceed the private costs, and they don't consider the social costs, and therefore there's an over-allocation of resources to these products. In terms of positive externalities, they're under-allocated in a free market. Consumers and producers don't consider the third-party benefits, and therefore the cost often exceeds the private benefit but not the social benefit. What I mean by that is, say the cost of schooling is $30,000, the private benefit is $20,000, you don't go, but there's also a $20,000 benefit for society more generally. So theoretically, the overall social benefit, which incorporates both the private and the external benefit, is $40,000, which is higher than the cost, so they need to subsidise it to bring the cost down to take into account both the private and the external benefit. And the last one, asymmetric information. The market failure there is that it often leads to adverse selection, and that can occur in both the short and the long term. It can lead to moral hazard, and all of these things lead to an inefficient allocation of resources. So it can hurt your living standards because you might purchase a second-hand car that's no good. It might be the case that people don't get insurance because insurance premiums increase. You need to be able to articulate what the inefficiency is. So in terms of subsidies and market failures, subsidies can be used to rectify any one of these market failures. So in the case of public goods, you need to subsidise producers the full cost of the product so that they're willing to do it. Because they can't extract any revenue out of making that product, they need to subsidise them, give them, for example, a cash grant for the full cost so they'll be willing to produce that product. With negative externalities, we subsidise it to achieve a more efficient allocation of resources. So we subsidise products that are potentially don't have the same negative externalities to lower their relative price. So a good example is subsidising renewable energy. So you could argue that renewable energy has positive externalities, or you could argue that it helps to prevent the incidence of negative externalities. So to prevent negative externalities, we can subsidise other products that are less harmful. So for example, in the market for energy, we can subsidise renewable energy to lower the relative price of renewable energy, and therefore there's less carbon emissions in society. For positive externalities, we subsidise the producers to lower their costs of production, and the idea is to internalise the positive externality. We essentially allow them to benefit from the benefit they're providing to the community, which will reduce the price for consumers and prevent the under-allocation of resources. With asymmetric information, again, we can use subsidies. So subsidies to provide documentaries, making consumers more aware of the benefits of certain products. So for example, it might be that we subsidise ads for healthy living, or documentaries for healthy living, or the benefits of eating fruit and vegetables. Or we could subsidise campaigns to show about the negative side effects of products with negative externalities. So we could have documentaries onto alcohol and tobacco, or things like the sugar campaign. So that sugar movie, I think it was called, We subsidise that so people are aware of all the dangers of over-consuming sugary products, or things like Super Size Me, where we look at the dangers of McDonald's, and that should help to achieve efficiency because we're more aware of our purchases and therefore less likely to purchase adversely. Advertising and market failures, again with negative externalities, the idea of advertising is to shift the demand curve to the left, lead to a lower price, and therefore less good resources allocated to these products with negative externalities. So that might be advertising into the dangers about cigarettes, climate change, gambling ads, alcohol ads. All these things are trying to reduce demand and therefore reduce the incidence of the third-party costs associated with these transactions. Positive externalities, government advertising of the benefits of certain products will help to shift the demand curve to the right. So, for example, it might be a government advertisement of the benefits associated with the benefits of vaccinating your children. The idea of that is to encourage more people to vaccinate their children because they're aware of the costs of not doing so. So they might show ads with people suffering from particular diseases from not vaccinating their children. And asymmetric information, the advertising is trying to get people get consumers aware of either the positive or negative benefits or externalities associated with products. So getting them aware of the dangers of certain products so they make more informed decisions and act with perfect information. There's also what we call market-based approaches versus government regulations. So whenever you hear the word market-based approaches, we're looking at basically factors that are going to shift the demand or supply curve. So generally looking at taxes and subsidies, their aim is to influence relative prices and internalise either the positive or negative externality and influence demand that way. Government regulations are generally referred to as bans on certain products or regulations that stop people from buying a certain product. So banning drugs is a government regulation. Age restrictions and licenses are government regulations, which stop people from smoking. Minimum school leaving ages to keep people at school, that's an example of a government regulation. So not taxes and subsidies, governments regulating the market by either banning things, making things compulsory. So for example, it's illegal not to wear a bike helmet. That's an example of a government regulation. Bans on fishing with nets, cyanide, etc. Bans on advertising certain products, so you can't advertise the benefits of cigarettes. You can't advertise takeaway food during times where students are most likely to be watching TV, so like between 4 and 5. So government regulations are when we tell people exactly what they can and can't do through banning products or through regulating the markets or ensuring they have to use things or fines, where market-based approaches are things that influence demand and supply like taxes and subsidies. So it's important that you know the distinction between the two. So now we're going to look at each individual market failure. So starting with public goods, just a couple of questions related to public goods. One of the ones from your booklet is to explain why each of the following are either private or public goods, and it's only worth 3 marks, so it's not a lot of detail about each one. But if we start with roads and education, they have some characteristics of public goods, but they are excludable and therefore they're not strictly public goods. So private schools require students to pay. Schools can also restrict people based on gender, intelligence, location. Likewise, with roads, you can exclude people based on tolls. So in both cases, they're excludable. They're also rivalrous because with roads, if there could be traffic jams, so that affects people can't use them simultaneously, or it affects others' ability to enjoy the road or how quickly they can get to work when there's too many people on the road. Education, again, is rivalrous because there's only a certain amount of teachers, a certain amount of resources, etc. And then with streetlights are more of a public good because you can't prevent people from using them. And when we say you can't prevent them, it's really inefficient to prevent people from using them because you'd need someone monitoring and standing underneath each streetlight, which would be very hard to do. It's a lot easier to exclude people from a road or exclude people from schooling. It's also non-rivalrous because one person's consumption of a streetlight doesn't affect other people's ability to enjoy it. There's light for everybody. Why does the existence of public goods lead to market failure? In your answer, explain why resources are not allocated optimally. So a pure public good such as a lighthouse would be under-allocated in a free market. That the service that is provided is both non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So those who do not pay for lighthouses to operate cannot be excluded from using its services because essentially as long as they can get access to the water, it's quite easy to use the light. The consumption by one boat also doesn't reduce the amount of light available for the others. So use a clear-cut example of a public good, then explain why it's a market failure. So there is an incentive to free ride as the producer cannot exclude non-payers. So nobody would pay, and as a result, the manufacturer cannot receive the full value from the customers and will therefore have a lower profit or no profit at all. Given that they are acting in their own self-interest, they will choose to allocate their resources elsewhere. This means that more people will crash into cliffs and society's welfare will be worse off. So the result is there's an under-allocation of resources to lighthouses, something that's important for society because you can't make people pay, there's no profit motive, and therefore essentially no self-interested producer would bother producing that product. You need to articulate that really clearly and articulate these products are good for society. There's clear benefits of having lighthouses. Identify and explain 2 ways the government can reduce the market failure associated with the production of public goods. So 2 ways the government can ensure public goods are provided in socially optimal quantities include government subsidies and direct government intervention. So they may involve heavily subsidising producers, so they might give them cash payments. Sometimes they can offer things like no interest loans and things like that. This will provide enough income to the supplier to make it profitable for them to produce the product. So for example, street lights are produced by private companies and they receive the subsidy from the government. The other thing they can do is direct government intervention. That means the government produce the goods with taxpayers' funds. That includes things like defence and defence equipment, so they can provide the service to the public. Okay, so in terms of the Defence Force, what the government do is they provide all the money for the equipment, they purchase tanks, etc. They also offer defence personnel attractive wages and employment conditions to lure people into the industry. So more resources are allocated to defence because of the fact that they offer high wages, so the government pays workers. They also put all the money towards the equipment, things like that. It would be highly inefficient to just have the private market provide defence. Negative and positive externalities. Okay, so when you're talking about the impacts of taxes and subsidies on goods with positive and negative externalities, it's really important that you use specific language. So if you're looking at positive externalities, any question where it asks you, explain what the positive externality is and how subsidies can operate, it's really important that you explain the positive externality in detail. Okay, so if it's education, articulate the positive externality is the fact that when you get a good job in the future, because of your education, you'll pay tax, you're less likely to be involved in crime, you can participate more actively in society, and then without the subsidies, goods are under-allocated to production because consumers and producers don't consider the third-party benefits. The impact of the subsidy is to decrease production costs, shift the supply curve to the right and lower the price. So just like market mechanism questions, explain what the subsidy actually does, and that helps to lower the price and reallocate resources to that product. By subsidising this production, it helps to internalise the positive externalities and achieve a more efficient allocation of resources. So really clearly articulate that the subsidy lowers production costs, reduces the price, and then helps to internalise the positive externality to prevent the under-allocation of resources to that area. With negative externalities, explain what the negative externality is in detail. Explain without taxes that goods will be overproduced because they don't consider these third-party costs. So again, if it's alcohol, talk about how it can lead to violence, how it can lead to taxpayer funds being wasted, helping people's health. It can lead to drink driving. If we assume that consumers and producers don't consider this, so resources are over-allocated to these products. Explain the impact the tax has on the market. So the tax increases production costs, shifts supply to the left, and increases the price. Okay, then articulate that the higher price then deters consumption, and therefore more resources will shift into other areas, and in this way we've internalised the negative externality. So it's really important, when you're talking about taxes, you talk about the higher price, supply shifts to the left, higher prices, that deters demand, resources shift into other areas. Okay, so examples of questions. Explain why the consumption of alcohol is an example of a market failure. So what that means is explain what the third-party costs are, and how the government can intervene to help internalise the negative externality, and then 2 reasons why it might not be effective. Explain what alcopops are really quickly. They're mixed vodka drinks. It's a negative externality in consumption. Explain what that negative externality is that causes binge drinking, violence, etc. Really clearly articulate why it's a market failure. So it's not just that it's got negative externalities, but the consumers and producers don't consider these external costs, and therefore there's an over-allocation of resources to these products. Make sure you articulate that really clearly. Therefore, the government taxes these goods to internalise the negative externality. That shifts supply to the left, leads to a shortage and increases the price. The higher price deters consumption, which should lead to a more efficient allocation of resources because resources shift into other areas that are less harmful. 2 reasons why it might be ineffective. 1 is that we switch to other forms of alcohol like wine and beers, and 2, it's relatively inelastic. So the demand is less than proportionate to a change in price. So a lot of people will consume alcohol anyway. Thank you.